Well, thanks, everybody. I don't think we can say anything that would enlighten you that you haven't already heard from MMB. Just to say that I guess I'm not overly surprised that revenue has slipped a little bit. If you look at our GDP growth in 14 and 15, that slide number 4 that you saw, it showed 2.4% in 14, 2.4% in 15. If anything, maybe the takeaway for me is maybe we were a little too optimistic in November when we were predicting 2.9 for 16, and now we're back down to 2.4, which is where we were the last 2 calendar years. So the kind of interesting thing in it all is feels like we're about where we were in June when we went home. The economy is still growing at a, coming out of that deep recession we had in 8 and 9, still growing at about the same slow growth rate, which is certainly good news. And I have told my caucus repeatedly since November that please don't make any ongoing spending commitments that are going to carry out into the tails until after February, because we knew the money that we had was one time. Interestingly enough, the $900 million that we now see, when we went home at the end of session, because we didn't get a tax and transportation bill, we left $865 million unspent. So I think we're kind of where we were, and I think probably most Minnesotans probably feel that too. They don't feel a lot probably has changed since May. So it's good news. It's good news in the out biennium that we still have a structural surplus out there, but I think it urges caution that we don't overcommit, because there's I don't know what inflation is in the out biennium. We took it out of the forecast back in 2002, but there's a number in there. And it may not be 1.7 billion, which is what the number on your sheet shows, but it's not zero either. So somewhere between that 1.7 and 0, there's a number of what we're going to be able to hone in on for inflation in the next biennium. And I think we're showing just short of 1.2 in a structural balance. So I just would urge some caution on behalf of all of the interest groups that are interested in this session as it relates to spending, tax or spending decisions going forward that have an impact on the next biennium.
Well, everybody said it. I suppose the economic forecast does show a stable budget, but there is uncertainty in the future. That's certain. And to me, what that means is that we ought to have a relentless focus this year on helping those families that have been feeling the squeeze of this economy that's not working for everybody. As we get into more uncertainty, that's even more important than it ever was. And if we do that this year, I think we can have a successful session, one that was going to make lives better for ordinary Minnesotans, and that's the recipe for making life better for Minnesota. We've heard a lot of the problems that are still out there for ordinary Minnesotans. We need to address things like prescription drug costs that are squeezing budgets, childcare costs, higher education costs. Those are things that Minnesotans are talking about, making sure that people have access to broadband. Those are things that will make a difference in ordinary Minnesotans' lives. And we want to continue to focus on that and rebalance our economy so that it is working for everybody. If you look at the Republican budget proposals from last year, and particularly their special interest tax bill, that would have clearly, at this point, there's no question, would have left our state in a significant budget deficit. And when that happens, our state budget is in trouble, but more importantly, who pays for that? It's ordinary Minnesota families. So those families that the Republicans love to talk about, getting money in their budget, in their pockets, their tax bill ultimately takes money out of those folks' pockets, and it hurts Minnesota families and doesn't provide the kind of opportunity that we need. So I hope that we do keep this relentless focus on ordinary families. And I guess what I would say is that there are also plenty of other ways that don't dip into the budget that we can move forward on that can help Minnesota families this year. Some examples would be earned sick and safe leave and paid family leave. They don't cost the budget a single dime, but could make a huge difference, again, for ordinary Minnesota families. So, if the 2015 session was a do-nothing session, we do have a chance to do over in 2016 and make it a can-do session. And I hope that we take advantage of that opportunity, and we are certainly ready to get to work on making that happen.
I just want to make one comment. If you take a look at the MMB budget book, not the slides they presented, and you take a look at the statement from the Council of Economic Advisors, I was very struck at the council meeting 2 weeks ago, and I'm trying to think, see, Representative Knobloch was there, Representative Carlson, myself, in terms of listening to, getting the chance to listen to what was discussed. To a person, every economist there said that the GDP projection by IHS was too optimistic. Now, they weren't suggesting that we would expect to go into a recession. I forget what I think the definition of recession is 3/4 of negative growth, I think. I'm not sure about that. So it's not to suggest that we're going into a recession, but for our purposes in terms of a budget forecast, I found it very striking that all of the economists were unanimous in saying that IHS was too optimistic. And again, if you take a look at the budget pages of the MMB book, you'll find that in there, the 2 or 3 pages that quote the council. So it does suggest that we have to be very careful during this year's session, going into next year's session. So whether it be a supplemental finance bill, whether it be a tax bill, whatever it is, if we have ongoing spending that is in any way significant, it could easily lead in the next biennium for the 18-19 years to a deficit.
It's hard to figure out how many ways to say that we need to be cautious because the forecast has got significant change from what we had in November. I do really just want to add one thing, and that is that any of the proposals that are coming forward for this legislative session, from my perspective, should be fully paid for in this biennial budget. That would mean I wouldn't think that anything that's phased in, those sort of proposals, would have a very good chance of success because of the impacts on the out years. As Lori Sturdivant questioned the commissioner, when you look at the impacts of inflation on this, the spending does not include that. And so we have to take all of those things into account. Anything that's phased in would clearly be a negative in the out years. So those would have a tough run, I believe.
Good afternoon. In our last briefing together for the forecast, it was already evident that the economy in the world was beginning to slow just a little bit. So where we are today is really no surprise. And for me, I think it brings our work into real clear focus, which is a good thing. I think it, makes us tighten up our agenda. It makes us think through what's most important for Minnesotans. And as I continue to talk with Minnesotans, it seems real clear to me that they are frustrated about the economy and about the sense that as hard as they're working, they can't quite get ahead. And so as we think about this next budget, I hope my colleagues and I work together to bring relief to some of the things that they think are priorities. First and foremost for me, we have to make sure that we don't punch a hole in the budget by promising a tax cut that creates deficits in the future. And I know that's a key priority for the Republicans, and I hope they're going to be careful because deficit spending for us is a disaster for working families. And then I want to say that on the priority for kids, right? We still have kids waiting for Head Start. We have kids waiting in line for affordable childcare. We have kids waiting for pre-K. And while we are paying attention to the economy and it's slowing, we still have a very steadily budget, a balanced budget with a sturdy and stable surplus. And I think that there is enough here for us to begin to do some work for our youngest kids in Minnesota. Thank you.
Does this forecast kill any major tax cuts in your mind?
Seems pretty difficult. And frankly, it's going to make it difficult to even do something in the tax area that's really, really important to me, and that is kind of improving the relationship between our state and local governments. So the Senate feels really strongly, and we brought to conference additional local government aid for cities and county program aid for counties, but that has implications in the tails also, and it really was one of the things that Senator Skoye and I in the tax committee felt very strongly about is helping local governments, state be a little better partner, and it just got harder. I don't know how much, today at least, we're going to be willing to commit in the tails, looking at what's out there. But, you know, we just lost $800 million in the tails. So I think our appetite to create additional spending or tax cuts out there that have tails impacts has probably waned significantly. You know, I lived through that more than a decade. And if my friends on the other side of the aisle say, well, if we just cut taxes, we're going to get out of this, let me preempt it. I have been there. Now, none of the Republicans that I served with, or almost none, were there when we cut taxes my first 7 years in office. From 95 to 01, we cut taxes every single year, and we ended up with more than a decade of deficits. It did not create the growth that we were promised that it would, and that's just the history of it. And it's not going to do it this time either. So I can just tell you, the Senate is not going to take a strategy of, you know, this slow growth. If we just could cut taxes, we're going to grow faster. Not going to happen. Didn't happen in the 90s through 2001 when we did it. And we're not going to repeat the same mistake and plunge ourselves into deficits for the next decade going forward by some phony idea that somehow if we cut taxes, the economy is going to grow.
Mr. Leader, what about pre-K and the initiatives that the governor's been talking about? Does this make that more difficult also?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I have been reminding all of my committee chairs, this is not a budget year. So bringing forward major initiatives has always historically happened in budget years. And, you know, it looked like there was a little more money than we have today. So all of the advocacy groups were starting to kind of ring the bell on the committee chairs that, gee, there's money to be able to do some things, but clearly it got harder today.
What else got harder? Give us a list of what else might not happen.
Well, I think everything got a little harder. I think it's probably unlikely we pass a $1.4 billion bonding bill. I think the conversations I've had with the speaker, he's had some reluctance to do that. I was really hoping we could get to a $1.4 billion number by putting some cash in to supplement what the speaker's willing to do in bonding, that we actually could get to the governor's number with some cash. But now some of our cash is gone. So, I mean, getting to a $1.4 billion cash bonding bills got harder today to hit on the governor's number. You know, I know the House Republicans really wanted to put some general fund into transportation. Well, it's not a transportation plan if you do it for 1 year. So the opportunity to use general fund now to fund transportation going forward into the tails got much harder. And we do have some things we need to do that have ongoing tails pressure. Things like our sex offender program that the federal courts have determined is unconstitutional. There's a real chunk of money that we have to commit to that program that is ongoing as we look for ways to address the constitutionality question with the federal court. So there clearly are some budgetary pressures, maybe across many of the areas of the budget that is going to create some tail spending, things that are kind of must do. So that makes fitting other new things in that aren't must do that much more difficult today.
Jesse check style rebates, things that don't have tails. Would that be an example of something without tails that you'd consider?
You could. I think it's unlikely the Senate will do that. You could ask the Senate tax chair, but.
With this 900 million figure, how much would you be comfortable doing in ongoing new spending or tax cuts? Is there a 300 million or 100, or is there a number in there?
You know, I think I don't know that yet. I mean, the conversation that we had earlier with the commissioner of MMB, that inflation issue came up, that 1.7 something that you see as a footnote in the forecast page. And it's like I said earlier, 1.7 anticipates inflation across the entire budget. Well, as the legislature hones in on new appropriations a year from now, I'm sure that number can be trimmed down. We're not going to do inflation across the entire budget. So I think the 1.7 is really just kind of a planning estimate for MMB. But what I know is it's not zero. So I think we need to work a little bit with the administration and try to figure out if it's not 1.7, what is it? And we've got about, looks like I think close to 1.2 if I remember, available. But anything we do this session that adds to that takes away from the 1.2 that is available. But, you know, it's actually good news. I mean, we got a structurally balanced budget, but it still urges caution if you're going to continue to have a structurally balanced budget. But coming off of the decade after 2001, this is a great forecast.